Hello, and welcome to
Small talk about the big issue. I'm Lorraine.
And I'm Kiara. Welcome back to this third episode, which will kind of keep building on the last episode on who's going to pay the price.
In the previous episode, one of the major points we had tried to make was that climate change was a global issue, that it would affect all of us, but we had kind of hinted at the fact that it wasn't necessarily going to be a fair issue, that it wasn't going to impact everyone equally. And we think this is a really important part of the discussion around climate change. And this episode is a sort of overview of the types of inequality that might be strengthened or caused by climate change.
I wouldn't have put it better than you, Lorraine. That's amazing. So in this episode, we aim at investigating if the effects of climate change are going to be the same across our planet. And we can already tell you that they're not going to be. And then we hope to give you an idea of the inequalities that will arise due to climate change induced by global warming. So we're going to start, as always, by a scientific introduction, kind of laying the basis, the groundwork of what you need to understand why climate change is not going to be fair and in what ways this is going to be translated in our world. And then we're doing something really special this week.
Yes, we innovate. So usually in our second part, one of us will discuss a very recent scientific article that hasn't really been made accessible to the public yet, and hopefully you learn something that you couldn't have read anywhere else or heard anywhere else. But today I would like to do something a bit different and to take Kiara and hopefully some of our listeners on a sort of activity. Wow. I won't say more. Stay tuned. Well, but this is going to be a very interactive episode. I think, Kiara, you're going to be very mobilized in the second part.
Yes, I can't wait. We'll get over the facts very quickly.
No, please
we'll
give
take
context.
All the time required to treat such an important and pressing issue. So let's start by saying that there's globally three main parameters which can predict the increase in warming on our planet and which areas will be more subjected to that warming. First of all, it is known that oceans warm more slowly than lands. We've also started to explain this in previous episodes that it takes more heat to warm water than it takes heat to heat up the atmosphere or the land. And at the same time, our oceans are a lot deeper than our atmosphere is thick, so it can hold a lot more heat. So expect heat to increase more strongly on land than on water. That is fact number one. Number two, the middle of our continents are going to warm up faster than our coasts. Why is that? Well, usually there's more moisture on coastal areas. The middle of the continents has more drier soils, which heat up faster. And because there is less humidity, there's going to be less global warming mitigation, as also oceans absorb heat. So coastal areas are faced with less heat increase compared to more drier inland areas. So that is point number two. There's going to be more warming inland than on the coasts. And then lastly, higher latitudes around the Arctic, but even below that, will experience and are experiencing faster warming. So this is also something we already kind of discussed. This is partly due to the albedo. Lorraine, do you want to refresh our memory?
I can. I'd refer people to episode 1 where we've discussed it, but albedo is generally a way we have of quantifying the absorbance of a surface, and so how much infrared it would release back into our atmosphere, so how much heating it would generate potentially, and usually darker surfaces will generate more heating than lighter ones. So ice melting is a problem because it usually gives way to sea, which is a lot darker in color, for example.
Absolutely. In a very simple way, you can see that white surfaces just typically reflect a lot of sunlight, whereas darker surfaces absorb it and therefore contribute to warming. And the thing is, in the Arctic and in higher latitudes, well, the snow is melting, the ice is melting, so what used to be white slowly turns darker and then absorbs a lot more energy, which is then translated into more heat in the poles. And at the same time, there's also a redistribution of the heat because there's a lot of extra tropical heat, which also will be redistributed by the atmosphere. And the warming of the poles is going to be a lot stronger because there's a lot more potential for warming there, as it is the coldest part of our planet. So, for instance, the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the global average. Of course, this has many consequences. One of the many I could cite is that the solid permafrost, which is the frozen ground that you can find up in high latitudes, is thawing and becomes mushy. This disrupts both wildlife and human activities, which rely on that soil to transport either merchandise or to migrate to other habitats. So, to summarize, there's 3 points to be aware of with global warming and how it affects different areas of our globe differently. The lands will warm faster than the oceans. The inner continents will warm faster than coasts, and higher latitudes around the poles and so on will also warm faster than areas around the equator.
So, are you discussing a sort of geographical inequality when it comes to facing climate change?
Yes, this is actually the first part I wanted to start
Okay.
with while discussing this podcast. We're going to start in a very geographical area. How, where you live, will determine the kind of warming you're going to experience.
Okay.
As you said, Lorraine, the first part of this episode is dealing with the differences on a geographic level. During my research, I found a very shocking number that said that up to half the world's population lives in areas which are highly vulnerable to climate change. That's 3.3 to 3.6 billion people that are going to be affected or that are highly vulnerable to the changes induced by global warming.
That's alarming, but I'd say given what we discussed in the previous episode, not unsurprising. I'd be interested, do you know like how direct this threat is or what kind of threat? Because I know like sea level rise, for example, we had discussed in the previous episode, is going to impact a lot of people because a lot of capitals or big cities are by the sea. But it's a fairly long-term threat.
Yeah, that is definitely taken into account. I think they include also storms, floods, water and food scarcity induced by global warming. So I think it's everything we talked about in the last episode that is going to highly affect half the world's population. It doesn't mean that they're the only ones that are going to be affected, but half of the world's population are going to be extremely vulnerable to everything that's going to happen.
Yeah, that's not good at all.
And speaking of which, when you talked about flooding and seawater rise, there's 1 billion people which are expected to face strong floodings every year by 2050, so in less than 25 years. But this is already the case in a lot of places. Small islands, for example, have already faced longer droughts, deeper floods. Their fish has also already been spoiled by ocean warming. And as we mentioned last episode, there's also a big issue with freshwater contamination by rising sea levels when the salty water penetrates deeper inland and then contaminates the fresh water that those populations rely on.
And on a small island nation that might not rise very high above the sea and that's surrounded by salty water, it's easy to imagine that that might become problematic really fast.
Absolutely, yeah. How vulnerable those populations are to sea level rise and climate change. This is also the case for global precipitation, which is expected to increase globally, but that rainfall is not going to be distributed equally around the globe. There's some parts of the world which will experience, as we said, an increase both in frequency and in intensity of rain. But in other parts of the world, it will get drier for longer. But so in the places where there's more precipitation, an example of that would be the poles, in which in some areas, snowfall is expected to increase enough to make up for the melting of the ice due to global warming.
Okay, that's good.
But at the same time, where does that water come from? The answer is pretty clear. It comes from the tropics and the equator, where evaporation will increase strongly in those regions, will experience a lot less rain. This means that a lot more people will lack drinking water, but also this will increase food scarcity because it will be harder to grow crops. And in those areas which do experience a lot more precipitation. That precipitation will not be evenly distributed throughout the year as well. But we've already discussed it before, and we'll say it again. When a region has been dry for a long time, and then there's the equivalent of months of rain which fall in the span of a few days, that causes flooding. The soil is not ready to take up all that moisture. It's disruptive to both ecosystems and to the agriculture and to the people living in those regions.
This is why it's important when you look at precipitation levels, not to just look at the net amount per year, but also its distribution throughout the year. And ideally, you want something that's more even or more linked to seasonality.
That's very true. And lastly, the melting of the glaciers, which we're witnessing worldwide, doesn't impact everyone equally, because in some regions, there's entire populations that depend on it for water, used in cities or in agriculture. While now there might be a lot more water coming from those glaciers as there's a lot of melting, there's a big concern about the long-term impacts of this melting for water availability in the future when those resources will be used up. So this is the case in northern India, where many populations rely on the Himalayan glaciers for their freshwater uptake. But even within those places, global warming will not have the same impact on everyone. There's also a social side to it, which is the next part I want to introduce in this episode, starting with indigenous communities, which rely a lot more directly on the environment and are some of the first to feel the impact of climate change, because they depend a lot more on the seasonal flow of water, but also on their ecosystem for themselves, for the cattle. There's examples of nomadic tribes in Namibia, for example, who have to travel a lot further to find water for their animals. A more local example here in Sweden would be the Sami population, which lives in northern Fennoscandia, and that relies heavily on their reindeers for food and for their livelihood. And their reindeers have had trouble accessing lichen, which is the food source they rely on in winter, because of the rainier, milder winter that we experience right now due to climate change. So a rainier, milder winter means that there's going to be a lot more thawing and freezing. So the snow that has accumulated is going to melt, but then freeze again and melt again and freeze again, which usually creates a strong icy cover around the lichen, which is then a lot less accessible to reindeer.
Oh, that's really fascinating.
And so this directly affects Sami populations, which rely very directly on the environment for food production or for sustaining their reindeers.
It's true that when you think about the lifestyle, and maybe in this context specifically the food sources of a lot of the people I guess we come in contact with on a daily basis, they come from elsewhere. We don't rely directly on the land that's around us. And so it's true that if there's an issue or something has affected the agriculture in one spot, then we might not feel it because we can get that same source of food from another spot. But really, there's been destruction that we're unaware of. Yeah. And for populations that are directly reliant on their immediate surroundings, then that issue is a lot stronger for them.
Yeah, that's precisely it. Of course, this is the case for indigenous people, but that can also be the case for small-scale food producers or low-income households who also rely on the environment a lot more for their work or for their food. And they usually have to face the consequences, and this usually results in malnourishment. Marginalized groups, such as religious, ethnic, or LGBTQ minorities, are also more likely to live in unstable housing, for example, that is more vulnerable to storms, to flooding. So those are also the groups of people which will be struck first or the hardest by climate change.
And natural disasters.
Yes. So the next level to look on is, of course, the economic level. Countries will be more or less vulnerable to climate change based on their economy and their infrastructure. Countries that lack infrastructures, for example, less hospitals, doctors, vaccines, they will be faced with more death and suffering from diseases spreading due to climate change. And colonialism has a lot of responsibility when it comes to that, because it can be shown that countries that were once ruled by a colonial power are more likely to suffer from poverty today. And there's something called legacy effects, the legacy of colonialism, which translates into weakened institutions, but also economic dependency and underdevelopment, are all very big issues which increase that unevenness of climate change consequences, of that inequality between countries, which is, I think, very important to mention and to highlight, and probably to make another episode about.
Uh-huh. The historical aspect of climate change is something we'd like to discuss as well further, perhaps in the next episode. But yeah, I think it's interesting to link socioeconomic issues with climate change and to realize to what extent that's going to be an issue both across countries, but also within countries from what you're describing.
The last step I wanted to take in this description of the unevenness of climate change consequences was to look at how men and women are going to be impacted by climate change differently. And I know, Lorraine, that this is something that you are interested in, so I'm wondering if you want to add something to the topic.
Okay, I can a little bit. So last episode I mentioned I had read the IPCC technical summary quite a bit.
Yeah.
And several times the point was made that there was going to be some kind of gender inequality with respect to climate change. And I was really surprised because I, knew about this geographical inequality. I had some notions about socioeconomic inequality when facing climate change, but gender inequality was really a surprise to me. And so I looked into it.
Yeah.
And I found that there's a gender-based way in which people can be affected by climate change. And this is not everyone across the world. This is specifically women in more rural areas that are faced with extreme weather events.
Okay.
So it's quite a specific scenario, but still based off of what we've, discussed in this episode and in the previous one, a quite widespread one, because we've mentioned that extreme weather events are becoming an increasing issue worldwide. And there are two scenarios that there's been a United Nations report on these gender-based differences, and I had come across two examples that I thought might illustrate the different ways in which women would be impacted.
Yeah.
One of them was that extreme weather events tend to impact the traditional female roles in some rural communities. So, for example, collecting wood and water for the household to cook are traditional female roles in a lot of communities. And so depending on what kind of event you're facing, these resources might get more scarce, more difficult to access, and therefore you're increasing the amount of time you need to take to fulfill that role and that responsibility. And that might take time away from education, for example, for younger girls, or from a job for, older women.
That makes sense.
And so it means that you're having to devote more time to something that is a basic necessity, something you need to cook and something you need to drink.
Yeah, and this is exacerbated by climate change and the fact that those resources become more scarce and you need more time to go get them.
Exactly. And then linked to this response to extreme weather events that can have very strong economic impacts for families.
Yes.
In some parts of the world, because marriage is in part an economic transaction, it can be used as a way to recover from these hardships that people are facing due to climate change in part.
So what does that mean very concretely?
And so that can mean more child marriage, which is considered a form of gender-based violence because usually the women are the ones who are getting married younger. And so this is another very concrete example as to how natural disasters that are in part induced or worsened by climate change affect women in a way that's different and more strongly than it does men.
Thank you for educating us, Lorraine, because there's so many different ways that climate change is impacting different communities, different populations, different minorities that most of us are not even aware of. And I think that's a good step towards being more conscious of what it means that climate change is happening and what responsibility that we have in stopping it.
Yes, I think that's a really important point. And what the process of researching this taught me is that there are so many far-reaching ways in which climate change impacts people and things that you wouldn't necessarily think are linked.
Yeah.
And that it's really such a widespread issue. And again, I think it goes towards this idea that not everyone is impacted in the same way and that there's considerable inequality in terms of the challenges we face that are caused by climate change.
And this basically sums up the first part of the episode. I can kind of start teasing the next one, but just letting you know that we'll be looking into who's responsible for global warming. And I can let you know that the countries or the communities which are suffering most from global warming are usually the people who have contributed to it the least.
I think these episodes are really interesting, definitely for me, I hope for you and for our listeners as
Yes,
well, where
yeah, for
I've
sure.
always heard about climate change spoken in a very kind of scientific way, so
Mm-hmm.
the physical basis of it all,
Yeah.
the way it's going to impact ecosystems, but
Mm-hmm.
I had little awareness of how much of climate change is a social issue,
Mm-hmm.
both in terms of the challenges but also the solutions,
Yes.
which I'll get into for this second part. So maybe that's a good segue.
That's a perfect transition, Lorraine. Let's get started.
So this is a bit experimental, but I wanted to explore this idea of geographic inequality and to really
Yeah.
make it quite plain and to give also our listeners a way of looking up things for themselves in a way that's kind of visual and interactive. I think it does a good job of showing you this geographical inequality that you've mentioned that I think also underlies a lot of the other types of inequalities we've discussed.
Mm-hmm. I'm hooked.
So, what I'd like to introduce you to is the Interactive Atlas from the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. So, again, the IPCC. I might not reintroduce it for this episode. I invite any new listeners to go and listen to other episodes. But this is an interactive map of the world that was released in 2021. It's kind of a new feature of
Okay.
these IPCC reports. So it's the first time it's been released. So I don't know if there will be updated versions as new IPCC assessment reports are released. But it's a compilation of global and regional databases that are made up of models of climate change.
Okay.
So a model is, in this case, a computational representation, but it doesn't necessarily need to be computational. It's a computational representation of climate change
Yes.
as it is now and as we think it might be in the future, according to these different parameters we know impact climate change. So we've mentioned water vapor, we've mentioned ocean temperatures rising, and wind patterns. So all these things are
Yeah.
integrated, and we use them to predict the future, to explain the
Yeah.
present,
Yeah.
and to predict the future.
You lost me a little bit at all the computational talking. What does it look like? What can people expect to find when they go onto that interactive atlas?
So how about you go on to there now?
Okay.
So Kiara, you should definitely do this, and anyone listening from home, I also strongly advise you to look, but we'll kind of walk you through it, so you don't need to have this in front of your eyes.
So the
But go to
website.
https://interactive-atlas.ipcc.ch.
Okay, I'm there.
Are you logged on, Kiara?
Yes.
Okay, so now you'll be on a page from which you can access this interactive atlas. So if you'll scroll down, you'll see a tab you can click on called Regional Information.
Yes.
And it's separated in two diagonally. Click on the advanced version, Kiara.
Okay. So for our listeners as well, we want you to get the advanced experience.
And now, Kiara, you can tell me what you're seeing.
So I see a world map
Uh-huh.
with very beautiful but alarming shades of red. And I have a toolbar on the right. And when I look at the colors on the left, they tell me that dark red is for 6 degrees increase, whereas dark blue is -6 degree decrease.
Okay, so the interface, hopefully this answers your question, Kiara. The interface you're going to use, but that might not necessarily be the output of the models, but the output of the models I think is beyond the scope of this episode.
Let's keep it simple.
Is this map that you're going to be able to interact with. And what's really exciting about this tool is that it's flexible in terms of the spatial and temporal components that you can select. So you can choose to focus on the whole world. You can choose to focus on specific regions. You can choose to focus on different time periods. So you can look at future projections, but you can also look at historical trends that we've seen. Or you can also look at models for the past. So what we think the past looked like paleoclimate analyses and things.
That we discussed in our first episode.
Yes. So you can really play around with this model.
Okay. Yes, I can see that I can click on different regions.
So what I'd like you to do is
Yes.
to stay on the global mode because we want to see
Yes.
global trends just for the purpose of this activity. But it's really fun to look at different parts of the globe and to see how they might differ. And so what you should be seeing on top of the map is this row of different parameters that you can tweak. So the first one should be
Yes.
titled Dataset.
Yes.
And the default dataset you should be using is CMIP6. Is that correct, Kiara?
Yes, that's the one I'm using.
CMIP6, we had also mentioned in our first episode, stands for Coupled Model Intercomparison Project Phase 6. And CMIP is this very exciting international scientific collaboration that's part of the United Nations World Climate Research Program. And it's a collaboration of 49 international climate modeling groups who run different models to predict either, global trends but also regional trends. And CMIP is the compilation of all these different runs that might have slightly different outcomes. But because you're looking at all of them globally, you get this increased reliability that's based on comparison between them.
So this is kind of a summary or a compilation of all these different climate models that are being summarized into this one simple model that is easy to visualize on this map.
Exactly. So let's stay on CMIP6. Now, you've also got, next to this data set widget, a variable widget. And that should be, by default, mean temperature. Mean is a measure of an average, so let's stay on that. We want to see average temperatures, but you could also play around. There are different options there. To the right of that is another section called quantity and scenario. And by default, you should be on near term, which is 2021 to 2041.
Yes.
And the default scenario should be SSP1 to 2.6.
SSP1 2.6. Okay. What does that mean? What is that scenario? Is it the amount of warming we're going to experience?
So, it's good you ask. SSPs are very closely linked to these climate change inequalities that we were talking about. SSP stands for Shared Socioeconomic Pathways.
Okay.
And what they do is that they look at the potential socioeconomic trends over the next century. So they run until 2100. And they quantify the effects of the resulting developments on greenhouse gas concentrations. So they look at things like population growth, economic growth, education, urbanization, the rate of technological development, and they see how these would impact the amount of carbon and other greenhouse gases that we're releasing into the atmosphere.
So now I understand what an SSP is. I hope our listeners do too.
And this is a way of predicting our future that's independent of climate policy. So there's no climate policy variable in these models.
Yeah, you're not relying on policymakers to make any policies. You just translate the development of our societies into global warming.
Exactly. And so essentially, there are different SSPs, and every one of them represents a scenario. So I'll give you a quick rundown. There are 5 SSPs that stand for different ways in which our world would develop. So SSP1 is a sustainably led future. It's quite an optimistic one. So there is a gradual but consistent shift towards more emphasis on sustainable development. There is, more inclusive development, so that means there are inequalities that are reduced both across and within countries, and we're generally consuming less energy and resources.
So it's a little bit of a utopia.
Exactly. That's the goal.
That's the goal. That's what we aspire to. Good. What about the rest?
So SSP2 is considered kind of the middle of the road scenario, simply because it's between SSP1 and SSP3. And it's one in which global and national institutions work towards sustainable development, but they're making slower progress, in part because social, economic, and technological trends don't really change from historical patterns or for what we're experiencing now.
Okay, so there's not that big of an effort, but there's still the intention.
Yes, and so that results in uneven development and growth between countries, both in terms of economic and sustainability progress. SSP3 is one titled Regional Rivalry, and this is not a good option
No, that doesn't sound good.
This is where there's low priority on sustainable development
Mm-hmm.
because instead there's a strong push towards nationalism. And
Yeah.
so we've got more competitiveness and emphasis on national security. So countries aren't collaborating as much.
Yeah.
And that means that there's very high inequality between countries, both in
Mm-hmm.
terms of
Mm-hmm.
sustainability and in terms of economic growth.
This kind of feels like a dystopian novel. I feel like you're
Yeah,
listing different scenarios of fiction books.
yes, that's kind of what it's like.
Yeah.
SSP4 is a continuation of SSP3, so it's
Mm-hmm.
even worse.
Yeah.
It's, full on conflict and really very little concern for sustainable development.
Okay.
SSP5
Yeah.
is considered an optimistic scenario, even though it's achieved through fossil fuel development.
Okay.
And this is a scenario in which there's global open competitive markets, and that means that the technical innovation is very fast, and that's the path towards reaching sustainability.
Okay. So relying on private companies to find solution to global warming.
Yes. So the categories that you can click on the interactive atlas are these SSPs. You just have to focus on the first number. So right now you're on SSP 1
Yeah.
to 2.6.
Mm-hmm.
The 2.6 refers to something else, to another metric that we
Yeah.
have. So realistically, on the interactive atlas, you can select SSP1, SSP2, SSP3, and SSP5.
Yeah. I'm excited to start playing around with them.
Yes, so let's start playing with them. So
Uh-huh.
I want you to stay in the quantity section of your quantity and scenario. I want you to stay in the change of temperature as opposed to the value of temperature. That should be the default value. But we're looking at how much it's increasing, not what the absolute value is, just for now.
Yeah. So I stay put on change, not
Yeah,
value. Okay.
yeah. So you're using all
So,
default parameters for now. And what I want you to do is to have a good look at the map as you see it now. And then when you're ready, change to long term in terms of the period that you're looking at.
so to summarize, on dataset, I should have the model CMIP6.
Mm-hmm.
On variable, I should look at the mean temperature. Under quantity and scenario, I should be looking at the near term, so 2021 to 2040,
Yes.
using the scenario SSP1, which
Yes.
is our optimistic scenario, and look at the change in degrees rather than the absolute value.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So have a good look at the map and then change to long term, which is 2081 to 2100,
Okay.
and tell me what kind of differences you see.
Oh, wow. The first thing that strikes me is a very deep red color that you can see all around the Arctic.
Uh-huh.
What used to be kind of a middle, it's funny to talk about colors. What used to be some sort of medium red is now very, very deep and dark. And if you look at the scale to the left, it says there's going to be an increase superior to 6 degrees Celsius around those areas.
Okay, so really quite a strong increase in the Arctic.
Yeah.
But other than that,
I feel like most of the globe is unchanged. It's mostly an Arctic issue. And that makes sense because we're in the optimistic scenario right now, aren't we? I'm really scared of seeing now
yeah.
what happens if you move down to other scenarios.
So the takeaway for me from SSP1 is that the good news is if we manage to hit our sustainable development goals, which we know what we need to aim for, we can really mitigate the amount of temperature increase we see on continents and in the sea.
Yes, it's virtually unchanged, but the Arctic is still going to pay a strong price.
Yeah. So even in the most optimistic scenario, we have a problem with the Arctic.
Okay.
And this is quite problematic.
Of course.
Now, if we're less optimistic and we go to SSP2
Okay.
and do the same thing, near term then long term.
Yes. So between the two scenarios, in near term, I don't see that much of a difference. However, when I click on long term, I thought I was scared by the first map. Now it's even more scary. Everything's red, and I'm pretty sure it can get even more red in other scenarios. But I think it would be easier to list the places that are not red than those that are deeper red. So what used to be red in the Arctic in the other scenario now descends a lot deeper inland into Canada, Russia. Africa is also very red, Antarctica as well.
Just again to reiterate, that doesn't mean that these places are going to become the hottest on Earth. That means that they're the ones that are going to experience more warming. But as we've discussed previously, even a little bit of warming in some ecosystems is really problematic. And this is why we've discussed the Arctic so much.
Yes.
Because of the ice melting. Now, what also struck me when I saw this map was that you can really see what you were talking about before, Kiara, that the land is going to heat a lot more than the oceans, no?
That's true.
And I wanted maybe to satisfy the curiosity of any physics buffs listening and explain, because we've given one explanation, but there's another that we haven't discussed yet as to why land has smaller heat capacity than water. So as we've mentioned, the oceans have a greater capacity to cool themselves. And this is because, as Kiara mentioned at the beginning of the episodes, they're deeper, but also they can evaporate an unlimited potential amount of water to cool themselves, which the land cannot do. As we've mentioned, fresh water is a really precious resource on land for us, but also for the ecosystems that rely on them. So that means that because there's less evaporation possible on land, you're storing and releasing more heat. And so hopefully that's a clear explanation as to why continents are going to heat a lot more than oceans will.
Evaporation absorbs heat while melting releases heat.
Yeah, that's a good point to make. So there's a lot more that we could do with these models.
I thought this was a very useful tool to kind of see visually the consequences and how global warming is going to evolve in the next years, but playing with parameters and seeing what could happen if we decided to do something different, or what would happen if we keep going the way it is. And I think it's important to have these visual striking cues to remind us of where we're going if we just decide to sit back and not do anything about the situation.
Exactly. And for every episode, we try to leave you with a resource you can go and look at. And I think for this episode, I would really encourage you to go look at this interactive map of the IPCC. It's really easy to find online, and you can tweak so many more parameters. You can look at seasonal differences, and you can see that there's going to be a lot more warming in the winters, for example. You can look at the region of the world that you're from or you're in specifically. There's really a lot of different things you can look at, and it's really easy to access, and there are little help question marks that you can click on if you have any doubts about what you're looking at.
And feel free to listen to Lorraine's explanations again if you get a bit lost with the model. And don't forget to click on the advanced model, which will give you a lot more insight into global warming evolution.
Yes.
To summarize, global warming is going to affect us all, but in different ways. Global warming is going to have different consequences depending on whether you live in the continent or on the coast, whether you live in higher latitudes or near the equator, whether you live in an economically stable, thriving country, or if you don't live in an economically privileged country. And there are ways to visualize this in a very concrete visual way, such as the IPCC interactive atlas that Lorraine introduced and helped us explore.
Yes.
So I guess we'll finish up by saying, as always, feel free to comment or send us questions
at smalltalk.bigissue@gmail.com.
We're always very happy to hear your feedback, and we're looking forward to meeting you again for the next episode in 2 weeks, which is going to be titled
Who is to Blame?
So stick around again if you want to find out, and we'll be waiting for you.
Yes, thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.
We fact-checked this episode and wanted to clarify a few things. I have the tendency to talk about populations when I address groups of people. This is because of my education as an animal ecologist, but for humans it is more correct to speak of communities. Regarding the pronunciation of lichen, we did some research. Its Greek etymology means that it is indeed pronounced lichen. However, depending on where you come from, you might hear it pronounced as lichen. I also said that evaporation absorbs heat, while melting releases heat, which is only 50% correct. It is true that evaporation absorbs heat and therefore cools down coastal areas. However, melting does not release heat. Quite the contrary, it absorbs it too. This is because the heat helps breaking the bonds that connect water molecules and ice and turn them into a liquid phase. An example of a phase transition that releases heat is freezing. That's it for this episode. Of course, you're welcome to send us your own suggestions and corrections. See you next time.